I'm Jesse Nathan, and I teach here in the English department, and I want to say a few words of introduction about tonight's event, and to thank you all for coming out to hear this poetry and these luminaries. Czeław Miłosz, who was born in 1911 in what is today Lithuania, was a towering figure of 20th century literature, but his work has new and potent meaning when read in light of the 21st, as I think you'll see tonight. This is clear when you read Poet in the New World, new translations, some of them never before brought into English. Though he wrote in Polish, Miłosz lived and taught in Berkeley at this university for decades. And the body of his work in English is itself an immense contribution to English language, literature, and culture. This semester I'm teaching a course on that work. We're reading all of the English translations of Miłosz's poetry. Some of my students are here tonight. And we've been struck by the ways in which this work comes alive in our time and place. Miłosz looks without flinching at what it means to be complicit. He asks what it means to be free in a time of political violence, what our human responsibilities are. Miłosz understood resistance at a personal, local, and cosmic level, which is to say he resisted Nazis and Stalinists, but also, almost quixotically, the relentless force of time itself, of so-called progress, and even, maybe most importantly, the very terms of reality, terms dictating that each of us owe it one death, and that everything we love must die. Miłosz waged a kind of war on that reality, one poem at a time. With the publication of this new book, one of you hold it up for us? Yay. With the publication of this new book, there are now a few more poems available in English, a few more volleys in Miłosz's campaign. We are very lucky to have the book's translator, Berkeley's Robert Hass, here with us tonight. Bob, Professor Emeritus in the English department, inspires superlatives. He's one of our great poets. And Miłosz himself acknowledges somewhere that it was Miłosz's tremendous fortune to fall into the hands of a translator who happened to have maybe the best ear on the planet for the English language. Bob's most recent collection of poetry is Summer Snow, and he has a forthcoming book of essays, Third Commonness. He's won the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, and many other honors, and he was for many years Miłosz's neighbor, and they became friends. And Hass and Miłosz worked together to translate many of Miłosz's poems. And as Bob worked on this latest gathering of poems, put together 2 decades after Miłosz's death, he began to collaborate with the Polish-born musicologist and aesthetician Karol Berger, who is emeritus in the Stanford Music Department. Berger's honors are too many to list. He's a member of the Polish Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And he's written brilliantly about Bach, Mozart, Wagner, and others. And he was instrumental in the creation of these latest Miłosz translations, in helping them find their music in the English language while staying true to the resonances of their first lives in Polish. And our luck tonight is supreme indeed, for we are joined too by Peter Dale Scott, preeminent poet and author of, among others, Coming to Jakarta, great book-length political poem of the late 20th century, a professor emeritus here at the English department at Berkeley, a former diplomat born in Montreal to the poet F.R. Scott and the painter Marion Dale Scott, and someone who knew Miłosz in the early 1960s. Scott was one of Miłosz's first translators and interlocutors here at Berkeley. Peter's latest book is called Reading the Dream, published last year, and just before that, in 2023, he published Ecstatic Pessimist, a book about Miłosz that describes him as a poet of catastrophe and hope. I love that phrase, ecstatic pessimist. It fits Miłosz well. It's a great honor to introduce you to these three, Bob, Karol, Peter. Take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. So this is the book, and it's the poems that Czeław Miłosz wrote, a translation of the poems that Czeław Miłosz wrote between 1946 at the end of the Second World War in 1953, when finding the job he had taken as a diplomat for the new communist government of Poland intolerable, he defected and sought political asylum in Paris. And for a period in those years between 1951 and 53, he wrote a book that became a bestseller called The Captive Mind, about why he rejected the totalitarian imagination. It was a fraught time. There are less poems. He's incredibly industrious, and decade after decade, especially in his years peacefully in Berkeley, when he's up in the hills up there, looking at the Golden Gate Bridge and reading poems, writing poems in Polish that nobody could read. And he did that for a while, and then they gave him the Nobel Prize, and then everybody read the poems. So what our idea with the poem that Karol will talk about that got him into trouble was written during this period when he was a diplomat in Washington, D.C. He arrived in New York in 1946, coming away from the destruction of Warsaw. The uprising against the Nazis in Warsaw led to Hitler deciding to teach the vassal states an object lesson by destroying 80% of the buildings in Warsaw. You can think Gaza was almost complete destruction. It was from that city that Miłosz walked away, and then within a year found himself walking across Central Park as a young diplomat in that service. David Frick, who was professor emeritus in the Department of Slavic Language at Berkeley, proposed to me at Czesław's funeral in Krakow that we translate this untranslatable poem that got him in trouble and led to his defection, a poem called Treatise on Morals, that I'll let Karol talk about. But this was what started us on this project. It was David Frick's idea, and then he said, well, let's do all the poems of this period. And so we set about doing it, and we got about 2/3 of the way through it, and David died in his sleep, very peacefully. And but left me with a string, and I consulted Irina Paperna, who was here blessedly tonight, and said, help. And she said, I know exactly the help you need. Call Karol Berger. And I called Karol. And we went to work on this poem that he'll talk to you about. But we thought that to begin, we'd take you to Warsaw in 1946, the first poem in this book. He had left Warsaw with his wife and his wife's mother. They were almost immediately picked up by a German patrol and put into detention camp. They were boys playing football, soccer, near the camp edge. He called them over and gave them notes to various people that might get him and his wife, his girlfriend at the time, out of the German concentration camp. And one of them found their way to a nun in the local convent who spoke to the commandant and got them released. So they set out to the west toward the Russian army, which was advancing against the German army, while Warsaw was being destroyed, gone up in flames. And they were immediately robbed of all of their money and belongings, and spent some time on a farm getting put up in return for digging potatoes. There's a line here about that. Well, I was so well prepared. Just a brief thing. I rolled a cigarette and licked the paper, then a match in the little house of my hand, And why not a tinder box with flint? It's the moment that the thing he does in his poem is step outside history for a moment. And why not a tinder box with flint? The wind was blowing. I sat by the road at noon, smoking, thinking and thinking. Beside me, a pile of potatoes. He found his way from there to Krakow. In Krakow, he applied for a job as a diplomat in the new government of Poland that was being reformed. He got the job, and they sent him to New York. On the way, he stopped in London and he's 33 years old, stopped in London and had lunch with T.S. Eliot, whose poems he had translated. And then he found himself in New York in an apartment on the east side, having walked away from total destruction. He walked across Central Park to the east side. He was on the west side, walked across the park to the consulate of Poland, and he began to write poems. And one of the poems he wrote during this period is one about his last moments in Warsaw. He went back to visit it after the destruction. In Warsaw. What are you doing here, poet, in the ruins of St. John's Cathedral on this sunny day in spring? What are you thinking here, where the wind blowing from the Vistula scatters the red dust of the rubble? You swore never to be a ritual mourner. You swore never to touch the deep wounds of your nation, so you would not make them holy with the accursed holiness that pursues the descendants for many centuries. But the lament of Antigone, searching for her brother, is indeed beyond the power of endurance, and the heart is a stone in which is enclosed, like an insect, the dark love of a most unhappy land. I did not want to love so. That was not my design. I did not want to pity so. That was not my design. My pen is lighter than a hummingbird's feathers. That burden is too much for it to bear. How can I live in this country where the foot knocks against the unburied bones of our kin? I hear voices, see smiles. I can't write anything. 5 hands seize my pen and order me to write the story of their lives and their deaths. Was I born to become a ritual mourner? I wanted to sing of festivity, the greenwood into which Shakespeare once took me. Leave to poets a moment of happiness, otherwise your world will perish altogether. It's madness to live without joy, and to repeat to the dead, whose part was to be gladness, was to be glad in action and thought, and in the flesh, singing feasts, to leave them only these 2 salvaged words, truth and justice. So he gets on a ship with his wife and comes to America and works for 6 months in New York. His first response was the same as other Europeans right after the war, was sort of outrage at America. This is the first letter he wrote back to a friend, says, "These tall buildings are nonsense." And the neon, Times Square, and the neon is cheap. So he found his way, and then did so well, and he was transferred to Washington, where he began to try to do what we said in the title of this, become a poet in a new world. And I'm going to pass the story to Karol. I didn't say, and I should say before you read, that after David Fricke died, to whom this event is dedicated, And after Karol and I got together, we also got together with the poet Paul Ebenkamp, who's here. And the three of us together worked on translating some of these poems. So this is also from Paul and Dave.
Does this work? The poems of the wartime that Miłosz spent mostly in Warsaw under German occupation, he published almost immediately after the end of the war, still in 1945, in a volume called Ocalenie, Rescue. And actually, if I remember correctly, this poem in Warsaw is the last poem in this volume. And then he doesn't publish anything in a book form until 1953. So all of these poems appear in literary periodicals and magazines and so on, but it is only after his defection to Paris in 1951 that he collects poems of the period between 45 and 53 and publishes a volume called Światło Dzienne, Daylight, I suppose. Bob's volume is essentially Światło Dzienne. It is very similar to Światło. It's not identical, it doesn't correspond 100%, but it is like Światło Dzienne, except that there is this addition of the last poem from the previous volume. Some poems are omitted, and some poems are added, poems that Miłosz himself did not collect in Światło Dzienne. The centerpiece of Światło Dzienne, of Daylight, is undoubtedly this longest poem in the volume, Treatise on Morals. Basically, it is, well, I don't know if it is the greatest poem of this collection. That remains to be maybe discussed. It is certainly the politically and historically, biographically, most weighty one of these poems. It brings to mind it's a very long poem. It brings to mind long poems that Oden was writing in the 40s, too, especially New Year's Letter. I think Peter wrote about this subject in an illuminating way. What is important here is that he captures the essence of his moral political dilemmas with which he's struggling in this period. He's addressing this poem to someone. It is written as an address in second person singular. We don't know who it is. Probably someone like him. Most likely he himself is the addressee. At least this would be my guess. And he wants to he wants to find answers to two questions in particular. One question is individual, really. How do I preserve individual moral responsibility in this new era in which everybody is telling me that actually everything that is important happens because of some collective forces, class struggle, race struggle, and things like that. This is one question. And the other question is, how do I contribute to the preservation of semi-independent, semi-autonomous Polish culture under the conditions of occupation by the Soviet army. What I would like to do is I will read a very short excerpt from this poem, first in Polish and then in English, and I suppose you will hear his answer to these two questions in this short excerpt. Nie jesteś jednak tak bezwolny, a choćbyś był jak kamień polny, lawina bieg od tego zmienia, po jakich toczy się kamieniach. I jak zwykł mawiać już ktoś inny, możesz, więc wpłyń na bieg lawiny. Łagodź jej dzikość, okrucieństwo, do tego też potrzebne męstwo. A chociaż nowoczesne państwo na służbę brzmi samarytańską, zbyt wieleśmy widzieli zbrodni, byśmy się dobra wyrzec mogli i mówiąc, krew jest dzisiaj tania, zasiąść spokojnie do śniadania. Albo konieczność, widząc bredni, uznawać je za chleb powszedni. You are not, however, so helpless, and even if you were a stone in a field, an avalanche changes its course, depending on the stones it rolls over. And as someone else used to say, you have the power. Influence the course of the avalanche. Moderate its wildness and cruelty. This too requires courage. And though the modern state thunders against Samaritan service, we have seen too many crimes for us to be able to renounce the good, to say, blood is cheap today, and to be able to sit down to breakfast calmly. Or, seeing the necessity of spoken nonsense, to accept it as our daily bread.
The amazing thing about this poem is that it passed the censors in the new post-war government. So to do that,
You get a hearing in the back.
if you don't hear me, put your hand up in the back and I'll try and do a bit better. This poem was actually passed by the censors, and Miłosz accused in the captive mind many of his former colleagues in Poland of something called Ketman, which was disguising your real beliefs and putting them into language which would be acceptable. I think really, in a sense, this whole poem is itself an exercise in Ketman. He's trying to be anti-romantic. The first poem in this particular series is an elegy to Jonathan Swift, and he himself was in the romantic tradition of Mickiewicz, who had saved Poland in the time there was no state, there was only the culture, and that Poland survived as a unit because everybody was united behind the poetry of these three great, particularly these three great poets, who were prose writers too, but Mickiewicz, Krasiewicz, and Krasiewski, yes. But Miłosz also was shocked. You see, Mickiewicz wrote one poem in which he praised dying for the country. And he saw friends of his, younger poets mostly, a number of them died on the barricades in the Warsaw Uprising. And Miłosz was totally opposed to this tradition of Poland all through the 19th century. They had uprising after uprising after uprising, and they all failed, and the best people were killed. And Miłosz reproved the romantic tradition for this. So now he's trying to be anti-romantic and write satirical. These are, in the Polish, I think you could hear it, they're Swiftian couplets, very satirical, ironic, and it's a very long poem, and we can't begin to do justice to it. I want to say one more thing. You said it was based on New Year Letter. The real fact of the matter was a book that had brief publication in America. The title was The Double Man, and it talked about how we are two within ourselves, and this whole the Polish poem is full of this irony of doubleness, and even the little image that you saw of that pebble, of that stone, diverting the avalanche. That's an image that was in Auden for a quite different purpose. But Auden, too, I think he had gone to the Spanish Civil War and he went, you know, full of romantic idealism. And then when he saw that the people on his side were burning monasteries and raping nuns, it turned him away from a certain kind of naive romanticism. And that is in this poem too, in a way which we don't have time to develop tonight. But look for that book, The Double Man. Eliot kidnapped that book, and because he had the rights to everything Auden wrote, and then Auden forgot that and sent it somewhere else where it was going to be The Double Man. Eliot just mangled the poem because he actually rewrote where he talked about a double man and turned it into some nonsense. And all of this is because he's a businessman who wants to maintain his rights. And I think it's a scandal that it's still New Year Letter is all we have that's in print today from this major poem by Auden. I'm sure there are Auden letters here. How many people here have heard of his, I say really major poem with lots of footnotes, just like we haven't pointed this out, but the treatise on moral has lots of footnotes, so it's a mixture of poetry and prose, which becomes a feature of Miłosz's poetry for decades afterwards, and it's very important in this question of seeking a balance, and you have tyrannical forces pushing you in different directions. We seek for balance, and I think if anything, that's for me the theme. Well, I've talked too long. Thank you.
Just a little, the reason that this poem was not translated in English before was that based on W.H. Auden's poem, rhymed couplets, very clever, very ironic rhymed couplets, was that it was untranslatable. So we just didn't bother. I tried with Czeław, who thought the poem would only work if it rhymed, and would only rhyme if we did it, if it said exactly in English what it said in Polish. So we went through this with many poems. There's a simple poem of his, it's spoken by a mother to children, that is called Parable of a Poppy Seed. It goes, and it was written in imitation of Blake's Songs of Innocence, and it goes, the paraphrase would be, on a seed of poppy there's a tiny house, and inside it there are people and a cat, and outside a dog barks at the moon. It doesn't know he's in a poppy seed. It's the first stanza of that poem, which he also said just can't be translated. So I tried, on a seed of poppy is a tiny house, inside it are people, a cat and a mouse, outside in the yard, a dog bathes the moon, and then in his one world sleeps until noon. And I showed it to Czeław, and he said, mouse. There's no mouse in my poem. So we couldn't translate this poem and gave up. It was impossible. And so it was David Frick who said, well, let's just translate what it says. And I'll ask Karol in a minute to read a little more, but just what David said to me, and he would laugh as we were translating. He was having so much fun, and I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. But he said that we can get mostly the feel of it. There are two things about it for you, especially the young people in this wonderful audience. It took me a while really to understand, one, how much 19th century and early 20th century European intellectuals thought that the world was, in a Hegelian way, going somewhere. So the whole question of how to be a moral person in a violent place, full of untruths in a battle over how to explain the war in which millions of people have been killed, is to be understood and interpreted. And he, as McCarthyism was rising in Washington, finding himself as a diplomat for a communist country. And in his personal moral, didn't know how to be a moral person. What was up for grabs? How much is it, if it's the case that war finished off fascism and what's coming is socialism, shouldn't he go along with the Stalinist party that's at least trying to create a working person's communist justice society, that propaganda? Anyway, it was really up for grabs. And in the poem, which David said sounded to him like the rhythm of a Krakow cabaret song, was about what survived. And in the whole of the 12-line poem, he mentions three tactics. For the French, existentialism was the answer. For the Germans, phenomenology was the answer. And for the Poles, vodka was the answer. I'll read a little of that. To give you the flavor of the beginning of what Karol was reading. So the poem begins with another voice saying, in relation to all of this. His last book, the book of the war poems, was called Salvation.
Yeah, that's what they do.
Rescue. Is that rescue?
So the primary, if you look it up and get a machine translation, the primary thing it offers is salvation. Polish dictionary lists rescue as well. But I think in the context of the poems in Ocalenia, the book, it's like the famous couplet, what is poetry that does not save nations or people? That's not about rescue, that's about salvation. The last thing that Miłosz wanted to do was to rescue the pre-war Polish Republic, which he had contempt for.
So the beginning of the poem is, in quotations, just what, O poet, do you propose to rescue? Can anything save this earth, this so-called dawn of peace? What has it given us? A few morning glories among the ashes. Amazing image. A few morning glories among the ashes. It gave hope, bile, gave the heart cunning, and I don't think it's aroused much pity. It's the opening proposition of the poem. It then goes on into that dance. Peter, do you want to go from here? Karol, you're going to come back later to...
Right. So you want me to move on to the poem to Albert Einstein?
Yeah. Did anybody have a comment or response before?
Yeah, by all means.
Move on.
It's a shame that the poem is so huge, and it doesn't fit into this kind of format I've given you a few lines, but if you have any questions about treatise on morals, this is a good time to ask them.
He says the phenomenon of vodka is interesting. It's well worth a dissertation. Of all drinks, vodka alone is akin to the fumes of extermination. In it, you can see the shimmering of burning cities. Through its thin glass, the convicts go, and when the houses hiss at night and the fire is a pupil in the eye of the windows, the brothers Karamazov, with glum faces, have sat down to a leader as the smell of formic acid rises from the ant-heap and grows stronger in the summer heat. So the odor of this misfortunate land gives a signal to travelers coming from afar. So you get the tone and feel of the poem. Now let's get into Washington and trying to respond to the situation.
Well, this is his poem to Albert Einstein, and the full title is very important. It's to Albert Einstein, open paren, fragments, close paren. It's actually to two parts to the poem. And in the first, he's very reverential to meeting Einstein. And then in the second part, things have changed. And if we're looking at pages 68 and 69 in the book, if you have it, and at the end of the first part, he's frustrated because he wants to say something. He says that in the dream realized, however much the wrong way, it's for me an empty stage set and a burden, as if I wish to cry out in my sleep and can't. And then the beginning of the second fragment, which I believe was written maybe 2 years later, after he's made a decision. Well, I'll come to that in a moment. He's made a big decision about his relation to history. And about this time, he said there are in us, we come back to doubleness, he said there are in us a voice that wants to be a spectator, and there's also another part of us that wants to be an activist. And he had read Mann's Magic Mountain, and there are two figures there. One is Nafta, and the other is Settembrini. And Nafta, modeled on his Jesuit teacher, is somebody who's got a very clear idea that the world needs to be changed. And Settembrini is a humanist who just appreciates all that we have. And I think that what happens essentially in this poem, that Miłosz admires Einstein as a humanist and is himself a humanist. And then the second part, he admires Einstein as somebody who changed history by E equals mc squared and the conversion of matter into energy in the atomic bomb, which is a terrible gift in a way. And then his own decision to, as I say, to make angels, to turn ordinary people into angels, which is also, in a way, a very cruel and domineering thing. And in the last line, which is in this book, that hated spark for which Prometheus was tortured, is actually, quite clearly in Polish, a hated spark of Promethean torture. Not torture for Prometheus, but torture for Einstein and torture for Miłosz. So he's raising his voice here way beyond the ironic satirist in the treatise on Moses. Now I'll read. Listen, you heard my attempt to give shape to this poem. Listen as I read and see how much is true. In a blue tricot shirt and with the face of a clockmaker from the Jewish neighborhood in Warsaw, with a pipe and a white mane, smiling sadly, allow me, gracious old man, to offer you a poem. To use poetry in such a fashion brings me joy. The need to adore is strong. A girl hangs a picture of her favorite movie star on the wall. For me, I admit, it would not have essence if I were not able, life would not have essence if I were not able to admire. I hide in my heart unspoken words constantly. I regret being so little able to help people value the great beauty of the world. Everything interested me. The names of trees and plants, the rise of species, Darwin's journeys, Polynesian myths, the mating dress of birds, half-obliterated sculptures in forgotten lands. The microscopes in cold laboratories enticed me. I learned several languages, wishing to read about the 5th century in Rome, Greece, Alexandria. The 5th century, of course, I'm interrupted, being the 5th century of the fall of Rome, which is what he was witnessing in Europe, with Stalinism coming, threatening to overrun the whole continent. Anyway, I won't interrupt again. And about the 16th century in maritime Europe, critical epochs and similar to mine, which arose for me, a child in the ashes of the First World War, the thunder of cannons, the bellowing of cattle driven on roads over which our refugee cart was driven in the dust. If I turn to you today, that's of course Einstein, it is not only because forged from marble your bust stands where Newton and Copernicus stand in our memory, not that you succeeded in placing an equal sign between gravity and electricity. There is something greater in you, faith in the light of reason, invincible concern for our human species, for what can be, and alas, for what it can despicably squander. Not the cold of a neutral explorer of nature, but the warmth, the anxiety of genuine goodness. I'm ashamed to speak out loud. The matter that is so difficult to name, the matter of hope. The matter of hope chafes. I have seen people transformed into beasts or locked in the prison house of learned illusions. I am writing this in the capital of the United States. It's summer. The birds are making a racket along the avenues. Bright-colored cars speed by. People on the greens play ball, play golf, grill hot dogs on the fire grates in the park. The radios on the motorcycles bleat about spies, about fugitive criminals, war, communists, and about new weapons. The new Jerusalem of the old Puritans, their dream realized however much the wrong way, is for me an empty stage set and a burden. As if I wish to cry out in my sleep and can't. And then a space, and then 2 years later. I have, however, learned to say no. This is of old the privilege afforded to poets, that wages, weddings, baptisms, and funerals were not matter for us. A brilliance, perhaps, a play of lights over vast black waters, as if we walked past a glassed-in garden, seeing with regret more than is allowed. Are we, in fact, the enemies of the species who wish to change human beings by force into angels of pure intellect, to tear from the depths that hated spark? I'm reading the book for which Prometheus was tortured, and then I'm reading the literal, unmistakably the literal meaning, a hated spark of Promethean torture. So he's learned to say no. What you don't know from this poem is that the Pole approached him when he was in Washington in the company of a man called James Berger, who was a very famous figure once, ended up being quite reactionary and was the sort of the intellectual of Buckley's national, what is Buckley's journal? But at this moment he was working for the CIA, and the Franaszek biography of Miłosz in the Polish version, not in the English, which is quite considerably shorter, but in the Polish it says that he was offered an escape route. And the escape route was that Miłosz would not defect in America, which would sever him from the Polish public. It would be the end of him as a poet. Somebody else, Miłosz, who was a famous Polish poet, came to America, and after 7 years he committed suicide because he was cut off from his Polish culture. This would be better. He would go and join Polish exiles in Paris and join their Congress of Cultural Freedom, which was in fact subsidized by the CIA, but not controlled by it. No, it was a genuine meeting of intellectuals, many Americans that you may have heard of, Mary McCarthy, Dwight MacDonald, Robert Lowell. These were famous people, sincerely said, all right, Stalin now dominates Eastern Europe. We don't want him to come and dominate the West. This was the policy of containment at that time, and that's what the Congress was committed to. And that, ironically, is why James Burnham left, because he wanted rollback. He wanted to liberate Poland, but that was not U.S. policy at that time. And I'm saying all of this is not a digression, because when Miłosz publicly defected in the office of a Polish journal in Paris that was in fact funded by the CIA, he got up and he gave a speech, the title of which was No. So he had learned to say no when he wrote this poem in 50, and then in 1951, when he finally went public with his opposition to the Stalinist policies of his own country and the Stalinist designs on Western Europe, many people thought, even as late as 51, that the Italians and the French might vote communists in by an electoral vote. It was that strong a movement, and they were dedicated to fighting it. And, well, I guess I've said enough for now.
So this volume is a track of how he's trying to figure out how to write poetry during this time. He tries many things, many different voices, and the reason that he never had this whole book put together in English before, he said, was, well, it was a complicated time. I was trying to do too many things. I'd just write this book off as a loss. So he didn't translate all of it. When he defected in Paris, he was given a place to hide. He didn't know whether they were going to assassinate him. He didn't know whether they were going to ignore him. He was a young diplomat among other young diplomats. He'd made friends with Pablo Neruda and translated some of his poems. He said Polish poetry really needs some color, and he translated Pablo Neruda's poems. And anyway, he turned this way, turned that way, couldn't find his way. And the poems we translated here are some ways a record of that. When he defected, his wife and his new child were in Connecticut. And because he'd been a communist diplomat, there was no chance of him getting in the rising McCarthy period back into the United States at that point.
If I could say specifically, in the summer of 1950, they passed the McCarran Act, which explicitly forbade anyone who had worked from a communist government to have to leave. There was a huge campaign to let Miłosz in because he was so clearly anti-communist, but the law was the law. And there were many enemies of Miłosz in London, in Washington, even in Poland, because he was, but he was Miłosz. He was not just a joiner, he was Miłosz.
So this book is a record of those years in the poem. He wrote a poem about walking through Central Park, where the young are lying in each other's arms watching summer movies. And the flicker of the film on the tall buildings along Fifth Avenue reminds him of Old Santa Fe. And he takes his family to Virginia Beach, and he has a vision of all of the Warsaw dead marching like insects across the table where they're having their gorgeous summer meal. This haunted poems, ironic poems. a translation of Antigone Resistance poem, and finds his way at the end to getting his family back into together in Paris. And he writes the poems that I think we should probably end with. There are two of them at least. Karol?
Shall I read the middle kind? Yes. So I would like to move to a different poem, very different from Treatise on Morals. Written a few years later, this is 1951, that is to say the year of his defection, extremely turbulent year as Bob was describing. This is the poem that Miłosz chose to end this 1953 volume Daylight with. And of course, the last poem in the collection is chosen with care, obviously. It is written in the Alsatian village of Mittelbergheim, village or small town, I have never been there. It is written in the autumn of this extremely turbulent year of the defection, 1951. It seems to look forward rather than backward. In other words, I read it as a poem that looks forward toward the treatise on poetry that he will be writing in the next few years. This is his masterpiece, or one of his masterpieces that will appear in 1957. Toward the treatise on poetry rather than backward toward the treatise on morals. The dramatic events of the last few months are not even mentioned, at least not to my, I don't see them there. Instead, what we hear is of his metaphysical hopes. He wants to hope that driven by his daimonion, he will attain the moving frontier, these are his words now, the moving frontier beyond which the things of this earth are united. But he doesn't want it quite yet. For now, he just wants to linger in this providentially named Mittelbergheim. For me, this is the most beautiful poem in the whole collection. So let me read it in Polish and then English. Mittelbergheim. Wino śpi w beczkach z dębu nadreńskiego, budzi mnie dzwon kościółka między winnicami Mittelbergheim. Słyszę małe źródło pluszczące w cembrowinę na podwórzu, stuk drewniaków na ulicy, tytoń schnący pod okapem i pługi, i koła drewniane, i zbocza gór, i jesień przy mnie są. Oczy mam jeszcze zamknięte. Nie goń mnie, ogniu, potęgo, siło, bo jeszcze za wcześnie. Przeżyłem wiele lat i jak w tym śnie czułem, że sięgam ruchomej granicy, za którą spełnia się barwa i dźwięk. I połączone są rzeczy tej ziemi. Ust mi przemocą jeszcze nie otwieraj. Pozwól mi ufać, wierzyć, że dosięgnę. Daj mi przystanąć w Mittelbergheim. Ja wiem, że powinienem. Przy mnie są jesień i koła drewniane i liście tytoniu pod okapem. Tu i wszędzie jest moja ziemia. Gdziekolwiek się zwrócę i w jakimkolwiek usłyszę języku piosenkę dziecka, rozmowę kochanków, bardziej od innych szczęśliwy, mam wziąć spojrzenie, uśmiech, gwiazdę, jedwab zgięty na linii kolan. Pogodny, patrzący, mam iść górami w miękkim blasku dnia, nad wody, miasta, drogi, obyczaje. Ogniu, potęgu, siło, Ty, co mnie trzymasz we wnętrzu dłoni, której bruzdy są jak wąwozy olbrzymie, czesane wiatrem południa. Ty, co dajesz pewność w godzinie lęku, tygodniu zwątpienia. Za wcześnie jeszcze. Niech wino dojrzewa, niechaj podróżni śpią w Mittelbergheim. Wine sleeps in casks of Rhine oak. I am wakened by the bell of a chapel in the vineyards of Mittelbergheim. I hear a small spring trickling into a well in the yard, a clatter of sabots in the street, tobacco drying under the eaves, and ploughs and wooden wheels and mountain slopes and autumn are with me. I keep my eyes closed. Do not rush me, you, fire, power, might, for it is too early. I have lived through many years and, as in this half-dream, I felt I was attaining the moving frontier beyond which color and sound come true, and the things of this earth are united. Do not yet force me to open my lips. Let me trust and believe I will attain. Let me linger here in Mittelbergheim. I know I should. They are with me, autumn and wooden wheels and tobacco hang under the eaves. Here and everywhere is my homeland. Wherever I turn and in whatever language I would hear the song of a child, the conversation of lovers. Happier than anyone, I am to receive a glance, a smile, a star, silk creased at the knee, serene, beholding. I am to walk on hills in the soft glow of day, over waters, cities, roads, human customs. Fire, power, might, you who hold me in the palm of your hand, whose furrows are like immense gorges combed by southern wind. You who grant certainty in the hour of fear, in the week of doubt. It is too early. Let the wine mature. Let the travelers sleep in Mittelbergheim.
Amazing.
I read this poem for years. As Miłosz, realizing that he had left Poland, he was starting a new life, and as to read the poem in whatever language I would hear the song of a child, that he can, here and everywhere is my homeland, wherever I turn and in whatever language. You see him, he's ceasing to be just a Polish poet. He's on his way to becoming, I would say, a global poet. I believe he's been translated seriously into more than 30 languages, and I do believe sincerely that in Miłosz is the clearest poetic voice for how the world can move beyond the present crisis that we're in. That is my belief, and I'm tending to it. But I didn't realize that there's more going on in this poem than just the appreciation of relief that he's safely out of Poland and so on. It's not just a little pastoral evasion. And I learned this not from any biography of Miłosz. I've never seen it mentioned in an article about this poem or about Miłosz. But you know, I have two hats. I also write about the CIA. And in a book about the CIA, I learned that Miłosz was in Anlau, the castle of Anlau is just above the town of Mittelbergheim, at a CIA conference. And he came down from that conference and wrote this poem. And there is, I think, a dialectic going on in the poem between looking around at what's around him and being nourished by that, and the role that he is now playing as part of the CIA psychological war against communism. And he's very ambivalent about it. He doesn't say, oh, I'm a great man now, I'm doing a great thing. No, he really doesn't like the people he's working with. They live too expensively. He complains about when he goes to see people in the embassy see in Paris, they're always in the ritziest apartments, wearing the fanciest clothes. They're very much like the bureaucrats back in Poland. That he's ashamed to be well dressed when he's in Poland because people think he's part of the nomenclature. I couldn't remember the name before. That's the new class of bureaucrats that were running Poland. So he was ambivalent about it. And what is going on here is the interplay between his troubled thoughts about himself in this war and the nourishment that he gets from being down from the castle and in the village, with which is so many of his poems have similar descriptions of village life like this. And I don't know whether, Bob, did you know about the CIA conference? Did you? Karol? No, it's not in the, even in the Polish tragic biography, which I cannot pretend to have read, it's because my Polish is so weak. I read in it, but I could not, there's an index, I could not find any reference to that. It's, I think Miłosz, he wrote a little prose book, very interesting, called Miłosz's ABCs. And he does have an entry there for the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And he admits that he was at the Congress. And that's a long story, but I won't go into. He says we didn't know. And I think it's possible he didn't know that the Congress was, but I'm sure that at this conference in Handau, which apparently was a very important conference, and he was the star. They had no one else like Miłosz, who had a bona fide leftist tradition, able to speak so clearly about what was wrong, about the Stalinist requirement that everyone had to write diamat, poetry that conformed to dialectical materialism. And okay, that's enough.
So the other poem of the time that this happens is when he is with his family. Peter, you were going to read Notebook?
Yes. I'm sorry to be difficult, but I'm going to make one change, and I'll do it before I read it. It's page 1. So last poem in this book. This is not a poem of the 4 poems we've read, 2. The 2 were published in Daylight.
Would you make it louder, please?
Yeah, I'm sorry. This poem was translated by Miłosz and others, because it contains an important phrase in it, moment wieczny, eternal moment. A Polish critic made a whole book about it, and it turned it into a critical book which was translated into English. And that was the first time that Miłosz ever admitted that he had written this poem, was because it reveals that he had a choice between going with his wife and staying with his wife, I should say, and staying with his new career as a now quite famous, celebrated hero of the anti-communist movement and the author of The Captive Mind. And incidentally, somebody who they had to wait 33 months before they were reunited. They thought they would be reunited in weeks. It took almost 3 years. So I'll read the poem now.
He's reunited with his family.
Yes.
And they arrive and they go to the country.
And the beginning is a bit like Little Bergheim. Red beeches, shining poplars, and steep spruce behind October fog. In the valley, the lake steams. That's Lake Geneva. There is snow already on the hillsides of the other shore. Of life, what remains? Only this light, so that the eyes blink in the sunny noon of such a season. People say, this is, and no capacity, no artfulness can reach beyond what is, and memory, useless, loses its power. I'll come back to that line. Keg, smell of cider. The vicar mixes lime with a spade in front of the school. My son runs there on the path. Boys carry sacks of chestnuts gathered on the slope. This is now so. I'll just have to read it. There's so much that could be said. If I forget thee, Jerusalem, says the prophet, let my right hand wither. Underground tremors shake what is. Mountains crack and forests break, touched by what was and what will be. That's not being, that's becoming. Essay and Devenir, these are the two poles for Miłosz of everything. We could just be, or we can enter the world of becoming. And he says a lot about this in the treatise on poetry. So anyway, touched by what was and what will be, all that is crumbles into dust. Violent, clean, the world is again in ferment, and neither ambition nor memory ceases. Autumnal skies, the same in childhood, in adulthood and old age, I won't stare at you, and you, landscapes, nourishing our hearts with mild warmth. What poison dwells in you that you seal our lips, makes us sit with folded arms and the look of sleepy animals. Whatever finds order, peace, and an eternal moment in what is will vanish without a trace. Do you agree then to abolish what is and pluck from movement the eternal moment as a gleam on the current of the Black River? I do. Tak in Polish, yes. Now, that's it, and there's a choice, and the beauty of the nature he associates with his wife, and at the same time, I have to go back to that line, memory useless, loses its power. The word that is translated here as useless is a very clear word. Niepotrzebny, unnecessary, not necessary. So that there are memories that are not necessary that lose their power. He's not saying that memory loses its power, on the contrary. He's going to enter that world of becoming and approach the eternal moment from the side of becoming and abandon the side that is, which translates in practical terms into abandoning his wife, something that he regretted very much later on and writes about in his prose book, wonderful book, The Year of the Hunter. It's just it's a diary. It's literally what he wrote through 1 year in 1987, I think. But he is so candid about himself, and he is so candid about what a beautiful marriage he had and how sorry he is now that he wrecked it by being eager for fame and achievement in the realm of things. But this poem is where he is reaffirming what he had already affirmed in a way in much because he gave up his wife, no question. But he was two people, and he felt, and I can understand why he felt. You have to remember, because I lived through those years, unlike most of the people in this room. I remember the fear very vividly that Paris was going to become like East Germany, and a lot of us didn't want to see that happen. It was a desperate situation.
So, Karol, did you? I just wanted to say, first of all, that I'm very grateful to you, Peter, for choosing to read this poem, because I think it is another really great poem of this year's. For me, this is a counterpart of Nibelbergheim in many ways. I don't understand why he did not include it in this volume of 1953. Perhaps it was written in 1953, maybe too late to be included. It was never included in any of his collections. I don't know why.
He did not want Janka to see this poem. Janka died in 1986. It could have been. He participated. It was mostly translated for the English version of the book, the critical book. It's the whole poem is the first page of this critical book translated into English. And they thank Miłosz for having helped translate it. So he could have put it in the collected poems of 1984. He chose not to. Janka was still alive, that's very clear to me. Janka died in 1986. And then he could have published it, but this was a poem of his shame. He quotes the end of the poem in, oh no, this is, no, I'm going to get it wrong. I'm sorry, that's 96, and I did things wrong. I was about to say something wrong. I'll stop.
I think, Bob, it was an inspired decision to put this poem at the end of your volume. I think it's exactly right. I read it as Miłosz at his most Baudelarian, you know, to pluck the eternity out of the passing moment.
Yeah. I think we kept your attention long enough, but is there anybody have a question? Ever?
The portrait you described of Miłosz in that interregnum between the end of the Second World War and the consolidation of the American Imperium and the rise of the Cold War, when he goes from being a diplomat in the service of Stalinist Poland, then defects, writes poems during that period, and you describe his no, he can't live with that. And then the campaign or reluctance by a rising anti-communist Cold War consensus to fully embrace him. But then he has to make a decision to get out from underneath the suffocations of Stalinism, goes to congresses which are subsidized in some measure by the Central Intelligence Agency, and then caught between history and the desire to keep and preserve the autonomy of the individual's relation all the time to the world around him. To what extent, and I apologize for the Jamesian dependent clauses of this question, but to what extent over the decades that unfurled as he lived his life in the United States, did he feel himself in some way obligated to or hostage to the American Imperium? Did he maintain ambivalence toward that? Did he ever, in a full-throated way, declare no to that Pole that had provided him refuge and sought to enroll him in the anti-communist crusade? And to what extent did his poetry reflect any ambivalence with respect to that toxic choice?
I love that question, and I love all of the dependent clauses because it's a very complicated question.
Yes.
You know, the first poem, I was his translator for the first 6 years. He had students who also translated, but I was, I think, the first published poet who was working with him. And we did a book called Poziemie Nasze, Throughout Our Lands. He and I had a debate, it's singular in Polish, throughout our land, we're all one land. That was too much of an affront for the American audience, so he insisted on making it plural, throughout our lands. And that, it's all on the cultural level, but it's quite radical. It's full of the spirit of Henry Miller and Allen Ginsberg. And, you know, when he was a diplomat, he sought out Henry Miller in Big Sur. He went to Big Sur, and Henry Miller, you know, there was no email in those days. It just happened that Henry Miller wasn't there, one of the rare times he wasn't there. But then what I think was a big event in his political development was the free speech movement here at Berkeley. And he had seen, and we had other, not just him, but we had many scholars from Eastern Europe here, and all of them, we had so many meetings, Senate meetings, and there were about 5 of them, all from Europe, who said, this looks very nice, what they're calling for free speech, but it's going to end in fascism. And they were thinking back to the 1930s, when the movements to protest then were often became anti-Semitic. And one of Miłosz's own colleagues, Miłosz had to interfere in one of these protests because he was about to, if I'm getting this right, attack somebody for no other reason than he was Jewish. They didn't want to see that happen here. And people like myself, who were the majority, said, that's ridiculous. Don't worry, it's not going to be fascist. That's when Miłosz and I broke politically, because I defended the FSM and he attacked the FSM. He called it Maoism. But he was just speaking wildly there, whatever you said about the FSM. The Maoists didn't approve of these certain protests. They said it was bad for the working class. So that drove him, in a sense, out of his more advanced movement. He wrote a book, Visions from San Francisco, notably not Visions from Berkeley, because he was becoming anti-Berkeley. Part of it had to do with his children, who became, both of them, part of the drug culture. His older son, Tony. Is Tony Miłosz here tonight by chance? Tony got a degree in pharmaceutics. He's a pharmacologist. They took drugs very seriously, and Miłosz, of course, was appalled by that. So that, I think, for personal reasons, drove him towards the right. But he was careful. He always kept the government people at arm's length. And if he made a point of saying in his native realm that other people got easy money by working for the Voice of America, and he declined to work directly for the American government that way. And that was sincere in him. So I'm just giving you anecdotal answers to it because I think it's a very complicated situation. I think even in the Visions of San Francisco, he's looking at, this is 1968, you have the uprising in Paris, and he comments, and he said the people in Berkeley, they never cut down trees, but in Paris they were cutting down trees to build barricades. So he was studying it all from a kind of detailed point of view, which made him less opposed to the American resistance, which was in the main nonviolent, as opposed to what happened in Paris, which was in the main, I would say, quite violent. So it's complicated.
Carol, did you have a response to?
Not really. I just could only add that one senses also in the poems that we have been reading, someone who on the one hand is very engaged politically, but he doesn't want to be only enclosed in politics. He wants, it is not that he wants to escape the prison house of politics, but he doesn't, there are more important things in this world. And I think he wants to be in between being political and being metaphysical.
Well said, yes.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Amanda. I'm one of Professor Nathan's students. I want to thank you guys for being here. We've been studying Miłosz this semester. We've gotten real intimate with his collected work, and he speaks very highly of the poet and their role in history. And I was wondering what you guys pose is the answer to the question of what he thought of the poet and their role in writing history down or communicating his experiences. Why the poet opposed to maybe other artists like painters or even other writing forms?
Yeah, quoting the treatise on poetry that he wrote after this, which is one of his amazing works. He says, one good line of verse is worth a whole cartload of prose. That was his, he wrote 2 novels, he wrote many books of prose. What he believed in writing was poetry. I think there are at least 2 parts of that. One is that Poland, like Ireland, like Korea, were places where the culture survived in the language. Poland, between the Middle Ages and the 20th century, had been divided up between the Prussian, Austrian empires and the Russians. And so poets had a special place in the survival of the culture. So we had a very high sense of the vocation of the poet in the first place. And like all poets, he also had an ironic sense of, there are several poems in here that he wrestles with that. The idea that poetry is really a stupid and idle pastime, and the other that is very great. And he has one poem that kind of takes each point of view. So the importance of poetry for Polish culture was part of it. And the other part was because he was a poet, and he was trying to figure out how to make the music to capture the reality of his experience, and he thought it was incredibly important to do that.
I will say that 2 years after he won the Nobel Prize, he gave a series of lectures at Harvard, which were published the next year as The Witness of Poetry. And there is this remarkable statement in it, I think it's page 109, I carry it on my heart, where he says, poetry not only anticipates the future, but speeds its coming. And that's not empty words, because he knew then that stuff he had written in 1950s, he translated Simone Weil into Polish, and that inspired the Solidarity movement. And, you know, in 1982, people thought Solidarity was dead. In the end, it wasn't dead because the Polish official, the it wasn't Stalin's, but communist government, came to Solidarity and said, we can't run this country without you. We're inviting you to join the government. And a communist prime minister was succeeded by a Catholic prime minister who was a personal friend of Miłosz. And Miłosz had helped that come. I can't give you all the details now, but he had participated in that. And when he got the Nobel Prize, he talked about Lithuania. And nobody, including me at that time, thought, well, you can't do anything about Lithuania. That's part of the Soviet Union. 10 years later, thanks partly to Miłosz, of course not exclusively by any means, but Miłosz was part of the reason why the Soviet armies pulled out of Eastern Europe and the whole Soviet Union fell apart.
Wow, that's probably about all that we have time for, but thank you. A big round of applause for